The case of Swift Runner, the real-life Wendigo incident. Historical context and setting. The case of Swift Runner is one of the most chilling intersections of folklore, survival horror, and true crime in Canadian history. Taking place in the late 19th century, Swift Runner's story unfolded in the isolated, snowbound wilderness of Alberta during the winter of 1878–79. This was a time when survival in the unforgiving Canadian frontier depended on resilience, community, and the ability to live off the land. Swift Runner was a Cree hunter, trapper, and guide. Standing over 6 feet tall and of imposing stature, he was well regarded in his community for his strength and skills. However, his life was marred by a struggle with alcoholism, a vice that would ultimately play a role in his descent into infamy. The harsh winter of 1878. The winter of 1878 was brutal, with frigid temperatures, deep snow, and scarce food supplies. Swift Runner took his family, his wife, 6 children, his mother-in-law, and a brother into the wilderness, far from any settlement, to wait out the cold season. The Cree people, like many indigenous communities, were accustomed to surviving in extreme conditions, relying on hunting, fishing, and foraging. Yet, as the winter dragged on, something went terribly wrong. When spring came and Swift Runner returned to civilization alone, his tale raised immediate suspicions. Swift Runner's return and suspicious behavior. In the spring of 1879, Swift Runner stumbled into a Hudson's Bay Company trading post near Fort Saskatchewan, appearing agitated and disturbed. He claimed that his entire family had starved to death during the harsh winter. While this might have been believable, given the severe conditions, there were 2 glaring inconsistencies. 1. His physical condition. Despite his claims of starvation, Swift Runner looked remarkably healthy and well-nourished, casting doubt on his story. 2. Proximity to help. His camp had been set up only 25 miles from a Hudson's Bay outpost, a relatively short distance for a skilled outdoorsman. He could have easily sought assistance before starvation became fatal. These inconsistencies, combined with his erratic behavior, prompted local authorities to investigate his claims. The investigation. The Northwest Mounted Police, NWMP, traveled to Swift Runner's campsite to verify his story. What they found there would horrify even the most seasoned officers. 1. Human bones. Scattered around the site were the skeletal remains of Swift Runner's family. Many of the bones were broken, and some had been hollowed out to extract the marrow, a telltale sign of cannibalism. 2. Evidence of cooking. Bones bore knife marks and showed signs of being boiled, suggesting that the flesh had been intentionally prepared for consumption. Confronted with this gruesome evidence, Swift Runner confessed to the unthinkable. He had murdered and eaten his family during the winter. Yet his explanation for these acts was even more disturbing. The Wendigo defense. Swift Runner claimed that he had been possessed by the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit from Cree folklore. The Wendigo is said to manifest in individuals during periods of extreme hunger and desperation, driving them to commit cannibalism and other horrifying acts. Those possessed by the Wendigo are believed to develop an insatiable hunger for human flesh, alongside a descent into madness. According to Swift Runner, the spirit had overtaken him, compelling him to kill and consume his family despite having access to other food sources. He described feeling powerless against the Wendigo's influence, suggesting that he was not in control of his actions. The trial. Swift Runner was arrested and taken to Fort Saskatchewan, where he stood trial for the murder of his family. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including his detailed confession and the remains found at his campsite. During the trial, Swift Runner repeated his claim of Wendigo possession. However, the court rejected his defense as a mere attempt to shift blame for his atrocities. The jury viewed his actions as those of a man driven by desperation and madness, not supernatural forces. In December 1879, Swift Runner was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging, becoming one of the first individuals to be legally executed by the Canadian government. Cultural and psychological interpretations. The case of Swift Runner is often cited as an example of Wendigo psychosis, a controversial concept in anthropology and psychology. This term describes a cultural bound syndrome in which individuals, under extreme stress or starvation, develop an uncontrollable craving for human flesh and believe they are transforming into a Wendigo. 1. Cultural beliefs. Among the Cree, the Wendigo is not merely a cautionary tale but a deeply ingrained moral and spiritual concept. It represents the dangers of greed, isolation, and the loss of humanity. To turn to cannibalism was to invite the Wendigo spirit, marking the ultimate fall into evil. 2. Psychological perspective. Modern psychologists view Swift Runner's case as a combination of mental illness, alcoholism, and the extreme conditions of the winter. Starvation and isolation can lead to psychotic breaks, hallucinations, and a loss of moral judgment. Legacy of the Swift Runner case. Swift Runner's story remains one of the most infamous examples of how folklore and reality can intersect in terrifying ways. It continues to be studied as a historical case of survival horror, a cultural tragedy, and a psychological phenomenon. The case raises enduring questions about human behavior in extreme conditions. Was Swift Runner a victim of starvation and mental illness? Or was he truly consumed by the Wendigo spirit, as he believed? His story serves as a haunting reminder of the fragility of civilization when faced with nature's cruelest tests.